The suitcase sat by my bedroom door, packed and ready for 3 weeks. Inside were my comfortable walking shoes, the new sweater I'd bought specially for mountain evenings, and the photo album I'd prepared of our family memories to share around the campfire. I'd been counting down the days to our family vacation, like a child counting down to Christmas. But as I sat in my living room that evening, listening to my 3 grown children explain why I couldn't come along, I felt something inside me break that I didn't know could still be broken at 72. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder neglect. Now let me tell you what really happened. It was a Tuesday evening in June when Sarah, Michael, and Jessica came over for what I thought was a final planning meeting for our family trip to the Colorado Rockies. I'd made their favorite dinner, pot roast with all the trimmings, and had spread maps and brochures across the dining room table. The reservation confirmations were organized in neat piles, just like I'd always done when they were children, and I planned every detail of our vacations. "Mom, we need to talk," Sarah said, pushing away her barely touched plate. At 45, she was my eldest, and she still had that serious tone she'd used as a teenager when she was about to deliver bad news. I looked around the table at my 3 children. Michael was staring at his hands, and Jessica was fidgeting with her wedding ring. None of them would meet my eyes. "What is it, honey?" I asked, though something in my stomach was already sinking. "We've been talking," Jessica began, her voice too bright, too cheerful. "And we think this trip might be too much for you." "Too much?" I set down my fork. "What do you mean too much? I've been looking forward to this for months. I helped choose the cabin. I've been taking those walking classes at the senior center to prepare for the hiking trails." Michael finally looked up. "Mom, you're 72. The cabin is at 8,000 feet elevation. There's no cell service. What if something happens? What if something happens here?" I countered. "What if something happens to any of us anywhere?" "That's life, Michael." Sarah leaned forward, using the patient tone she reserved for difficult clients at her law firm. "Mom, be reasonable. You've been having those dizzy spells." I had one dizzy spell, and that was because I forgot to eat lunch, I interrupted. "Dr. Patterson said my blood pressure is better than yours." "Sarah, it's not just that," Jessica said softly. "You move slower now, you need more rest. We'll be hiking, doing outdoor activities. You'd be miserable, and honestly, we'd spend the whole time worrying about you instead of enjoying ourselves." The words hit me like a physical blow. "So you'd rather I stay home? Would rather you be safe," Sarah said firmly. "And comfortable. You can watch the house, water my plants, collect the mail. It's actually perfect. We need someone trustworthy here anyway." I looked at each of their faces, my children. The babies I'd carried, the toddlers I'd chased around this very house, the teenagers I'd driven to endless activities and stayed up worrying about. When had they started seeing me as a burden instead of their mother? "I've already paid my share of the expenses," I said quietly. "We'll pay you back," Michael said quickly. "Don't worry about the money, Mom." But it wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that they'd made this decision without me. It was about the way they'd talked about me like I was a fragile piece of furniture that might break if moved too far from home. "When did you decide this?" I asked. The silence stretched too long. "When?" I repeated, my voice sharper. "Last week," Jessica admitted. "When you mentioned being excited about the white water rafting, I said I wanted to try it. I didn't say I was definitely going to do it." "Mom," Sarah said, her lawyer voice getting stronger, "you're being dramatic. We're trying to be practical here. You should be grateful we're thinking of your safety." Grateful? I should be grateful that my own children thought I was too old and weak to spend time with them. I stood up slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to see every deliberate movement. "I think you should all go home now." "Mom," Michael started. "Go home. Pack for your trip. Have a wonderful time in Colorado." I began clearing the dishes, my movements sharp and precise. "I'll watch the house. I'll water the plants. I'll collect the mail. I'll be a good little old lady and stay safely at home where I belong." "You're being childish," Sarah said, standing as well. I turned to face her, my hands still full of dishes. "Am I? Or am I just disappointed that my children think so little of me?" They left one by one, each offering half-hearted apologies and promises to bring me back souvenirs. I stood at the window, and watched their cars disappear into the evening, leaving me alone with a dining room table still covered in travel brochures for a trip I wouldn't be taking. After I finished cleaning up, I sat in my late husband Robert's old armchair and looked around our living room. The family photos smiled back at me from every surface: graduations, weddings, grandchildren's birthdays. In every single one I was there. The constant, the caretaker, the one who made everything possible for everyone else. But when had I become invisible? When had I stopped being Eleanor, the woman who'd driven across the country alone when Robert was stationed in California? When had I stopped being the mother who'd learned to change her own oil and fix the furnace because there wasn't money to call a repairman? When had I become just grandma, too old and fragile to be included in my own family's life? I picked up one of the Colorado brochures that had fallen to the floor. Mountain vistas, crystal clear lakes, families hiking together. The families in the photos had grandparents too. Active, smiling grandparents who were part of the adventure. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Tomorrow, my children would load their cars and drive away for 2.5 weeks of family bonding that wouldn't include me. Tomorrow, I would begin my new role as the family house sitter. But as I drifted off to sleep, something was stirring in my chest. Not sadness, I'd felt enough of that for one evening. Something else. Something that felt almost like possibility. I just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting. I padded to my bedroom window in my robe and slippers, watching as my family loaded their vehicles with camping gear, coolers, and suitcases. The children, my grandchildren, were bouncing with excitement, their voices carrying across the quiet neighborhood as they talked about hiking and fishing and roasting marshmallows. Jessica's youngest, 8-year-old Emma, looked toward my house and waved. I waved back, forcing a smile. She said something to her mother, probably asking why Grandma wasn't coming, because Jessica glanced over and gave me a quick, guilty wave before ushering Emma into the car. Within an hour, they were gone. The street fell silent except for the distant hum of Mr. Peterson's lawnmower 3 houses down. I made myself coffee and toast, the same breakfast I'd eaten alone for the past 5 years since Robert died, but somehow it tasted more bitter this morning. The kitchen felt too quiet, too empty. I found myself looking at the phone, wondering if I should call my sister Margaret in Phoenix, or my friend Dorothy from book club. But what would I say? That my own children thought I was too old to vacation with them. The pride that had sustained me through raising 3 children, as a nearly single mother while Robert traveled for work. The same pride that had gotten me through his illness and death, wouldn't let me make those calls. Instead, I wandered through the house, straightening things that were already straight, dusting surfaces that weren't dusty. In Robert's old office, the room I'd barely touched since he died, I found myself standing in front of his bookshelf. His travel books were still there, free along with the stack of brochures we'd collected over the years for trips we'd planned to take, someday. European river cruises, African safaris, train journeys through the Canadian Rockies, walking tours of Ireland. All the adventures we'd postponed, because there was always something more practical to spend money on: the kids' college tuitions, home repairs, building the savings account for retirement. Retirement, what a joke. We'd saved and planned for golden years that Robert never got to see, and I was apparently supposed to spend mine being grateful for being left behind. I pulled out a thick brochure for Viking River cruises, its pages filled with pictures of elegant ships gliding past European castles and vineyards. Robert had circled several itineraries in red ink, making notes in the margins about which excursions looked most interesting. His handwriting was still so familiar, so alive on the page. Romantic Rhine and Mosel. He'd written next to one itinerary, a perfect for our 40th anniversary. We'd never made it to our 40th anniversary. I sank into his old leather chair and flipped through the pages. Heidelberg Castle, the Swiss Alps, Amsterdam's tulip gardens, Paris, all the places I'd dreamed of seeing, all the experiences I'd put on hold for someday. My children thought I was too old for a family camping trip, but what if they were wrong? What if I wasn't too old for anything? The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. I was 72, not 92. I had my health, my wits, and thanks to Robert's life insurance and our careful saving, I had the money. The question wasn't whether I was too old to travel, the question was what I was waiting for. I opened my laptop. Yes, Sarah, your supposedly helpless mother owns and can operate a laptop, and typed in the Viking Cruises website. Within minutes I was looking at available departures. Most were booked months in advance, but as I scrolled through the options, one date jumped out at me. June 28th. A 14-day romantic Rhine cruise departing from Amsterdam. It was the exact itinerary Robert had circled, and it was leaving in exactly 4 days. 4 days. My heart was racing as I clicked on the availability. One stateroom left, a French balcony room on the upper deck. The price made me gulp. It was more than I'd spent on myself in the past 5 years combined. But then I thought about my children's faces last night. The way they'd looked at me like I was already gone, like I was just an old woman taking up space in their lives. I thought about Emma waving from the car window, probably wondering why Grandma wasn't coming on the adventure. I thought about Robert's handwriting in the margins of that brochure, all those dreams we'd postponed. Before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked, Book Now. The confirmation page loaded, asking for my credit card information. My cursor hovered over the first field. This was insane. I'd never traveled alone, never been out of the country without Robert. I didn't speak German or French or Dutch. I was 72 years old, and my children thought I couldn't handle a camping trip in Colorado. But maybe that was exactly why I needed to do this. I typed in my credit card number. 20 minutes later, I was the proud owner of a confirmation number for a luxury European river cruise departing in 4 days. The email confirmation sat in my inbox like a secret, like a promise I'd made to myself. I printed out the confirmation and sat staring at it, my coffee growing cold in my hands. What had I just done? I'd just proven that Eleanor Mitchell wasn't ready to be put out to pasture. Now I just had to figure out what to tell the neighbors about why I wouldn't be house sitting after all. I spent the rest of that first day in a fog of disbelief and panic. Every few hours, I'd pull up the cruise confirmation on my computer just to make sure I hadn't dreamed it. There it was in black and white: Eleanor Mitchell, passenger on the Viking Rhine cruise, departing Amsterdam in 3 days. 3 days. The reality of what I'd done kept hitting me in waves. I had no European clothes. I didn't have a current passport. Mine had expired 2 years after Robert died, and I'd never bothered to renew it. I had no idea how to get to Amsterdam, what to pack, or how to navigate a foreign airport by myself. What had I been thinking? By evening, I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the phone and seriously considering calling Viking to cancel the whole thing. I could get my money back if I canceled within 24 hours. I could go back to being sensible Eleanor who stayed home and watered plants and collected mail. That's when I heard the knock at my back door. "Eleanor, you okay in there?" Frank Torres's voice carried through the screen door. My neighbor of 15 years was standing on my back porch, holding what looked like a casserole dish. "I'm fine." "Frank," I called back, though I'm sure I didn't sound fine. "Just a minute." I smoothed my hair and opened the door. Frank was dressed in his usual uniform of khaki pants and a button-down shirt, his silver hair neatly combed. He'd been a mathematics professor at the community college before he retired, and even in retirement, he maintained the precise, thoughtful demeanor of an educator. "Maria made extra enchiladas," he said, holding up the dish. "She thought you might like some, especially with your family away on vacation." Maria was Frank's daughter, a sweet woman who visited him twice a week and worried about him almost as much as my children worried about me. The difference was that Maria's worry came from love, not from a desire to shuffle her father into the background of her life. "That's very kind," I said, accepting the warm dish. "Please tell Maria thank you." Frank lingered on the porch, and I realized he was studying my face with concern. "You sure you're all right? You look a little, I don't know, frazzled." Before I could stop myself, I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was the kind of laugh that comes right before tears, or right after you've done something completely insane. "Frazzled," I repeated. "That's a good word for it." Frank's eyebrows rose. In all our years as neighbors, I'd been the steady one. The one who brought him soup when he had the flu and helped him figure out how to use his smartphone. I was Eleanor Mitchell, the competent widow who had everything under control. "Want to talk about it?" he asked quietly, and suddenly, I did. "Come in," I said, stepping back from the door. "I'll make coffee. I have something to tell you. And you're probably going to think I've lost my mind." 20 minutes later, Frank was sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "Your children told you that you're too old to go camping with them, so you booked yourself on a European river cruise that leaves in 3 days. When you put it like that, it sounds crazy." Frazee? Frank leaned back in his chair. Eleanor. It sounds like the best thing I've heard in years. I blinked at him. Really, really. He took a sip of his coffee, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Do you know what Maria told me last week? She said I should consider moving to one of those senior living communities because I'm getting too old to maintain my house by myself. Your house is immaculate, Frank. I know that. You know that. But Maria sees me struggling to open a jar of pickles one time, and suddenly I'm incapacitated. He shook his head. When did our children start seeing us as broken down cars instead of people? I don't know, I said softly. But I'm tired of it. So what's the problem? You've got your cruise booked. Why do you look like you're about to call the whole thing off? I gestured helplessly at the pile of cruise documents I'd printed out and scattered across the table. Look at this, Frank. I need a passport. I need to figure out flights. I don't know what to pack, or how to get around Amsterdam, or what to do if something goes wrong. Frank picked up one of the papers, a packing checklist from the cruise line's website. Says here you need comfortable walking shoes, casual day wear, and 2 formal outfits for captain's dinners. He looked up at me. You own shoes and clothes, right? Well, yes, but, and this passport thing. He picked up another paper. There's an expedited service. Cost extra, but you can get it done in 24 hours if you're willing to drive to the federal building downtown. I stared at him. How do you know about expedited passports? Frank's cheeks colored slightly. I may have looked into renewing mine recently. Been thinking about taking a trip myself. We're nowhere in particular. Just away. Somewhere Maria can't worry about whether I'm eating enough vegetables or getting enough exercise. He paused. Where did you say this cruise starts? Amsterdam? Amsterdam, he repeated thoughtfully. I've always wanted to see Amsterdam. We sat in silence for a moment, the implication hanging in the air between us. Frank, I said slowly, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? That depends. Are you thinking that it's crazy for a 72-year-old woman to travel to Europe alone? But it might be perfectly reasonable for 2 competent adults to take a vacation together. My heart started beating faster. But the cruise is probably sold out. I got the last stateroom. Maybe I don't need to be on the cruise, Frank said. Maybe I just need to be in Europe at the same time. I could fly to Amsterdam, spend a few days seeing the city while you're cruising, meet you in, where does the cruise end? I shuffled through the papers. Budapest. Budapest. I could meet you in Budapest, and we could spend a few more days exploring before we fly home together. The idea was so perfect, so sensible, and yet so thrilling that I felt dizzy. Frank, we've been neighbors for 15 years, and I don't think we've ever spent more than an hour together at a time. So, some of the best travel companions are people who don't know each other well enough to get on each other's nerves. He grinned. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We discover we can't stand each other, and we're stuck in one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. There are worse fates. I looked at this man I'd known for so long, but never really known at all. Frank Torres, who brought me homegrown tomatoes every summer and always cleared my driveway when it snowed. Frank, who'd lost his wife 3 years ago and had been quietly going through the same adjustment to widowhood that I'd navigated. Frank, who understood exactly how it felt to have your own children treat you like you were already half dead. What do we tell our families? I asked. The truth. That we're 2 adults who decided to take a vacation. They'll think we've both lost our minds. Maybe we have, Frank said. Maybe it's about time. I thought about Sarah's face when she'd told me I was being dramatic. I thought about Jessica's too, bright voice explaining why I'd be happier staying home. I thought about Michael refusing to meet my eyes as he agreed that I was too old for family adventures. Then I thought about Robert's handwriting in that cruise brochure, all those dreams we'd postponed for someday. Okay, I said. Okay, Frank Torres. Let's go to Europe. Frank's face broke into a grin wider than any I'd seen from him in all our years as neighbors. Eleanor Mitchell. I think this is going to be the adventure of our lives. As soon as he left to go make his own travel arrangements, I called the passport office. Tomorrow, I would drive downtown and get my passport expedited. I would go shopping for European clothes and comfortable walking shoes. I would figure out international flights and foreign currency and all the things that seemed impossible this morning. But tonight, I was going to sit in Robert's chair and plan the adventure I should have taken years ago. For the first time since my children left for Colorado, I wasn't thinking about being left behind. I was thinking about moving forward, The next morning, I woke up with more energy than I'd felt in months. There was something intoxicating about having a secret, about knowing that while my family thought I was dutifully house-sitting, I was actually planning the adventure of a lifetime. Frank was already up and moving around in his backyard when I opened my kitchen blinds at 7 a.m. He caught sight of me through the window and gave me a cheerful wave, holding up his coffee mug in a sort of toast. I raised mine back, and we both started laughing at the absurdity of it all. My first stop was the federal building downtown for my expedited passport. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, barely looked up when I approached her window. "Purpose of travel?" she asked, stamping something with more force than necessary. "Pleasure," I said, and then, because it felt so good to say it out loud, "I'm taking a European river cruise." She looked up then, taking in my silver hair and sensible shoes. "By yourself?" "With a friend," I said, surprising myself with how confident I sounded. We decided it was time for an adventure. Something in her expression softened. "Good for you," she said, and she actually smiled. "Passport will be ready by 5 p.m. today. Next window for payment." By noon, I was at Nordstrom with a shopping list Frank had helped me create the night before. I hadn't been clothes shopping for anything other than necessities in years, and the young sales associate, Bethany, seemed genuinely excited to help me put together what she called a European capsule wardrobe. "The key is layers and versatility," she explained, pulling items from racks with the efficiency of someone who loved her job. "And comfort. You're going to be doing a lot of walking." 2 hours later, I walked out with 3 bags full of clothes I never would have bought for my old life: a soft cashmere cardigan in deep blue, comfortable but elegant walking shoes, a dress that could work for both sightseeing and dinner, and yes, 2 formal outfits for the captain's dinners that made me feel like Grace Kelly. "You look happy," Bethany had said as she rang up my purchases. "Special occasion, you could say that," I'd replied. "I'm celebrating my independence." When I got home, Frank was waiting on my porch with his laptop and a huge grin. "I did it," he announced. "Flight to Amsterdam tomorrow night, hotel reservation for 3 nights, and then a train ticket to Budapest to meet you when your cruise ends." Tomorrow night, my stomach fluttered. "That's cutting it close. That's what makes it an adventure," he said. "Besides, I figured if we're going to do this thing, we might as well really do it. None of this playing it safe nonsense." We spent the afternoon on my living room floor, surrounded by travel guides, maps, and printouts. Frank had somehow managed to research everything from European phone plans to the best restaurants in Amsterdam, while I worked on packing and repacking my new suitcase. "Frank," I said, holding up the elegant black dress I'd bought for formal dinners, "what if I don't fit in? What if everyone else on the cruise is, I don't know, more sophisticated?" He looked up from the guidebook he was reading. "Eleanor, you raised 3 children mostly by yourself, managed a household budget through 2 recessions, and nursed your husband through cancer with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. You think a bunch of tourists on a boat are going to intimidate you?" Put that way, it did sound rather silly. That evening, as I was double-checking my packing list, my phone rang. Sarah's number. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. "Hi, honey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Mom, how are you doing? I know this is your first night alone since we left, alone." If only she knew that I'd spent the day shopping, planning, and getting ready to fly to Amsterdam in 18 hours. "I'm fine, Sarah. Keeping busy. Good. Are you watering my plants?" I looked over at Sarah's drooping spider plant on my kitchen counter. In all the excitement, I'd completely forgotten about it. "Of course," I said, quickly moving to the sink to fill a glass with water. "And you're not overdoing it, are you? Not trying to do too much yard work or anything?" I thought about the 3 bags of European clothes upstairs, about Frank researching train schedules, about my new passport sitting on the kitchen counter. "No, dear, I'm not overdoing anything." "Good. Well, I should go. We're roasting marshmallows with the kids. I'll call you tomorrow to check in." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen, watering Sarah's plant and thinking about the conversation. She'd called to check on me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted alone for a day. The irony wasn't lost on me that tomorrow night, while she was tucked safely in her mountain cabin, I'd be 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The phone rang again. This time it was Jessica. "Mom, I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Michael was worried you seemed upset when we left." "I'm fine, Jessica. Because we didn't mean anything personal, right? About the trip. We just worry about you." There was something in her voice that made me pause. Jessica had always been my most sensitive child, the one who picked up on emotional undercurrents the others missed. "Jess," I said carefully, "do you remember when you were 16 and wanted to go on that school trip to Washington, D.C.? Of course. You and Dad said I was too young to travel that far without you. Do you remember what you said to me?" There was silence on the other end. Then, quietly, "I said that you were treating me like a baby instead of trusting me to be responsible." And what did I say back? Another pause. You said that maybe we could find a way for me to prove I was ready. And you did prove it. You got a job to help pay for the trip, you researched every museum and monument you wanted to see, and you came back more confident and independent than when you left. Mom, are you saying what I think you're saying? I took a deep breath. I'm saying that maybe it's time for you to trust me to know what I'm capable of. But Mom, you're 72. Yes, I am. And I'm also a grown woman with more life experience than anyone else in this family. I raised 3 children, managed a career, took care of your father through his illness, and I've been living independently for 5 years since he died. When exactly did I become too incompetent to make my own decisions? The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Mum, Jessica said finally, her voice very small, are you angry with us? The honest answer was yes, I was angry. But underneath the anger was something sadder and more complicated. I'm disappointed, I said. I'm disappointed that you see me as a burden instead of a person. I'm disappointed that you made a decision about my life without including me in the conversation. And I'm disappointed that you think love means keeping someone safe from living. Would you love you, Mom? So much. I know you do, sweetheart. But love should make people feel more alive, not less. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's chair and looked around at the life I'd built, the life my children thought was too small and fragile to leave behind. The family photos, the books, the comfortable furniture we'd chosen together. It was a good life, a life worth coming home to. But it wasn't a life worth hiding in. At 10 o'clock, Frank knocked on my door. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen from him since his wife died. To Eleanor Mitchell and Frank Torres, he said, handing me a glass, who may be 70-something, but are definitely not too old for anything. To proving them wrong, I replied, and we clinked glasses on my porch under the stars. Tomorrow night, I would be on a plane to Amsterdam. My family thought I was watering plants and collecting mail. Instead, I was about to discover who Eleanor Mitchell really was when she wasn't being anyone's mother, anyone's caretaker, or anyone's responsibility. I was about to discover who I'd always been underneath all those roles. As Frank walked back to his house, calling, "Sweet dreams, fellow adventurer," over his shoulder, I realized I couldn't wait to find out. The airplane wheels touched down at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport at 6:30 a.m. local time, and I had never felt more awake in my life. Despite getting only 3 hours of sleep on the overnight flight, I was practically vibrating with excitement as I made my way through customs with my shiny new passport. Frank was waiting for me in the arrivals area, holding a hand-lettered sign that read, ENR, fellow ATLANTT.GA, and grinning like a schoolboy. He'd arrived the day before and already looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, wearing a casual button-down shirt and jeans instead of his usual formal attire. "How was the flight?" he asked, taking my carry-on bag. "Terrifying and wonderful," I said honestly. I kept thinking I was going to chicken out and turn around at security. But then I remembered Sarah's face when she told me I was being dramatic, and I marched right onto that plane. "And now you're in Amsterdam," Frank said, spreading his arms wide. "How does it feel?" I looked around at the bustling international airport, listening to announcements in Dutch and German and languages I couldn't identify. Travelers of all ages hurried past with their rolling suitcases, heading to destinations I could only dream of. The morning light streaming through the terminal windows was different somehow, European light, I told myself, though I knew that was silly. "It feels like I'm someone else," I said. "Someone braver than Eleanor Mitchell." "You're still Eleanor Mitchell?" Frank said gently. "You're just the version of her that your family never bothered to notice." The taxi ride into Amsterdam was like a dream. Canal houses with their narrow, tilting facades. Bicycles everywhere, more bicycles than I'd ever seen in one place. Flower markets and cheese shops and cafes with tables spilling onto the sidewalks. I pressed my face to the window like a child, trying to see everything at once. "Frank, look at this place," I whispered. "It's like a fairy tale." "Wait until you see it up close," he said. I spent yesterday walking around getting lost on purpose. This city is full of surprises. My hotel was a converted canal house in the historic district, with a lobby that smelled like coffee and fresh flowers. The desk clerk, a young man with excellent English and an even better smile, welcomed me like I was a regular guest instead of a nervous American tourist. "Mrs. Mitchell, yes! Your room is ready, and I have some information about your cruise departure tomorrow. Would you like me to arrange transportation to the port?" "Please?" I said, still marveling that all of this was real, that I was actually here, that I was Eleanor Mitchell checking into a hotel in Amsterdam by herself. My room was small but perfect, with tall windows that looked out over the canal. I stood at those windows for a long time, watching boats drift by and people walking along the cobblestone streets below. Somewhere in Colorado, my children were probably having their morning coffee and wondering if I remembered to water Sarah's plants. They had no idea that their supposedly fragile mother was looking out at Dutch canals and planning her day in one of the world's most beautiful cities. Frank knocked on my door an hour later, after I'd showered and changed into one of my new European outfits. "Ready for the grand tour?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "What if I can't keep up? What if I get tired or lost or—" "Eleanor?" Frank's voice was patient but firm. "Yesterday I watched a woman who looked to be about 90 years old riding a bicycle through traffic while carrying groceries and talking on her phone. You're going to be fine." He was right, of course. Amsterdam was a city built for walking, and despite my children's concerns about my stamina, I found myself easily keeping pace with Frank as we wandered through the narrow streets. We visited the floating flower market, where I bought tulip bulbs to plant in my garden back home, a promise to myself that this trip was just the beginning. We toured the Rijksmuseum, where I stood in front of Vermeer's paintings and cried a little, though I couldn't exactly say why. "It's the beauty," Frank said quietly, understanding without my having to explain. "Sometimes when you've been numb for a long time, beauty hits you harder when you finally let yourself feel it again." That afternoon, we took a canal boat tour. I sat in the front of the boat with my face turned up to the sun, listening to the guide explain the history of the merchant houses and the engineering marvel of the canal system. The other tourists were couples, mostly some young, some middle-aged, some older than Frank and me. But none of them looked at us like we didn't belong there. "You know what I realized today?" I said to Frank as we sat at a sidewalk cafe that evening, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the world go by. "What's that?" "I haven't thought about my age once since we got here. Not once. At home, every conversation with my children is about what I can't do anymore, what I'm too old for, what might be dangerous for someone my age. But here I'm just a person having an experience." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Maria called me yesterday. She wanted to know if I was being careful and not overexerting myself. I told her I'd walked 10 miles through the city and felt better than I had in years." "What did she say?" "She asked if I was taking my blood pressure medication." He laughed, but there was sadness in it too. "I love my daughter Eleanor, but I think she's more comfortable with the idea of me declining than with the idea of me thriving." That evening, we walked along the canals as the sun set and the streetlights began to reflect in the water. The city felt magical in the golden light, and I found myself thinking about Robert, wishing he could see this, but also feeling grateful that I was finally here, finally living instead of just existing. "Frank," I said as we paused on a small bridge to watch a canal boat pass underneath, "can I tell you something that might sound crazy? At this point, I think we're beyond worrying about sounding crazy. I feel like I'm waking up. Like I've been asleep for 5 years, maybe longer, and I'm finally waking up." Frank was quiet for a moment, looking out over the water. "I know exactly what you mean," he said finally. "After Helen died, I thought my real life was over. I thought I was just waiting, going through the motions until it was my turn to go too. And now," he smiled, and in the soft light from the street lamps, I could see the man he must have been when he was younger, confident, curious, fully alive. "Now I think maybe the real adventure is just beginning." That night I called home to check my voicemail. There were 3 messages from my children, all variations on the theme of "Hope you're not overdoing it, Mom," and "Remember to rest." I stood at my hotel window, looking out at the Amsterdam nightlife, couples strolling arm in arm, groups of friends heading to dinner, a woman about my age walking confidently down the street with a small dog, and I felt a pang of sadness for what my children thought my life should be. Tomorrow, I would board the Viking cruise ship that would take me down the Rhine River to Switzerland and back. I would see castles and vineyards and medieval towns. I would eat foods I'd never tried and meet people from around the world. I would dance, yes, dance, at the captain's welcome party, and I would prove to myself, once and for all, that 72 was not too old for anything. But tonight, I was content to stand at my window in Amsterdam, watching life happen below me, and knowing that tomorrow I would step onto that ship as someone new. Not someone different from Eleanor Mitchell, but someone more completely Eleanor Mitchell than I'd been in years. I fell asleep that night with the sounds of the city drifting through my open window, and for the first time in longer than I could remember. I couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. The Viking cruise ship was not what I had expected. I'd imagined something enormous and overwhelming, the kind of floating city that would make me feel lost and insignificant. Instead, the Viking Magni was elegant and intimate, more like a floating boutique hotel than a massive cruise ship. Only 190 passengers, the welcome coordinator explained as I checked in, which meant everyone would get to know each other over the course of our 2-week journey. Frank had insisted on seeing me off, despite my protests that it wasn't necessary. "Are you kidding?" he'd said over breakfast at the hotel. "This is a historic moment. Eleanor Mitchell setting off on her maiden voyage of independence. I wouldn't miss it." Now, as I stood on the gangway with my suitcase, looking back at Frank on the dock, I felt a flutter of panic. What if I'd made a terrible mistake? What if I was too old for this after all? What if I spent the next 2 weeks feeling lonely and out of place? "Go," Frank called up to me, as if he could read my thoughts. "Go be magnificent." I took a deep breath, showed my cruise documents to the smiling crew member, and stepped aboard. My stateroom was small but beautifully appointed, with a French balcony that opened onto the river. I set my suitcase on the bed and stepped out onto the tiny balcony, looking down at the Amsterdam port. Frank was still there on the dock, and he waved when he saw me. I waved back, and suddenly I wasn't scared anymore. I was excited. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "Mrs. Mitchell," a cheerful voice called. "I'm Ingrid, your cruise director. Welcome aboard." Ingrid turned out to be an energetic woman in her 40s, with short blonde hair, and the kind of genuine enthusiasm that made you want to be her friend immediately. "First time with Viking?" she asked, stepping into my stateroom. "First time cruising at all," I admitted. Her face lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! You're in for such a treat. And traveling solo, good for you. We have several solo travelers on this cruise, and they always end up having the most fun." She spent 20 minutes walking me through everything: the dining times, the excursion options, the evening entertainment. She pointed out that all shore excursions were included, that wine and beer were complimentary with meals, and that the ship's library had an excellent collection. "Tonight is our welcome reception at 6, followed by dinner and dancing," she said. "I hope you'll join us. It's a wonderful way to meet your fellow passengers." After she left, I unpacked my clothes, hanging the formal dresses in the small closet and laying out the outfit I'd chosen for tonight, the elegant navy dress with the cashmere cardigan. Looking at myself in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. When had I started standing up straighter? When had my eyes started looking so alive? At 6 o'clock sharp, I made my way to the lounge for the welcome reception. The room was filled with couples and small groups, everyone looking excited and slightly overwhelmed. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found a spot near the windows where I could observe without feeling too conspicuous. "First-time cruiser?" I turned to find a woman about my age with perfectly styled silver hair and an expensive-looking outfit. She had the kind of confident bearing that suggested she'd been on many cruises before. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. She laughed. "Only because you have that wonderful wide-eyed look. I'm Vivian Parker from San Francisco, and you are Eleanor Mitchell from Ohio. Traveling alone." "Yes," I said, and was surprised by how proud I sounded saying it. "Good for you. I've been cruising solo for 10 years, ever since my husband passed. It's the only way to travel, if you ask me. Complete freedom to do what you want, when you want, without having to negotiate with anyone." Over the next hour, Vivian introduced me to what seemed like half the ship. There was Margaret and Bill from Texas, celebrating their 40th anniversary. Hans and Greta from Germany, who were taking their first vacation since retirement. A group of college friends from Australia who were traveling together for the first time in 30 years. And yes, several other solo travelers like myself, women and men who had decided that traveling alone was better than not traveling at all. "The secret," whispered Joan, a widow from Canada who was on her 5th Viking cruise, "is to say yes to everything. Every invitation, every excursion, every conversation. That's how you turn a vacation into an adventure." Dinner that first night was a revelation. I was seated at a table for 8 with people from 4 different countries. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, covering everything from European history to grandchildren to travel dreams. When our waiter, a charming young man from Romania, heard it was my first cruise, he insisted on bringing me a special dessert to celebrate new beginnings. "So Eleanor," said David, a retired teacher from England, "what inspired you to take this trip?" I thought about how to answer that. I could say I'd always wanted to see Europe, which was true. I could say it was a lifelong dream, which was also true. But somehow, surrounded by all these interesting people who had chosen adventure over comfort, I found myself telling the truth. "My adult children told me I was too old to go camping with them," I said. "So I decided to prove them wrong by booking a European cruise instead." The table fell quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. Then David started laughing. "Brilliant," he said. "Absolutely brilliant. What did they say when you told them?" "I haven't told them yet," I admitted. "They think I'm house-sitting." This caused an eruption of laughter and approval from the entire table. "You're my new hero," declared Susan, a nurse from Chicago. "My daughter thinks I'm too old to live in my own apartment. My son wants me to move to assisted living because I got dizzy once," added Hans. "Once! They mean well," I said, though I wasn't sure I entirely believed it anymore. "Do they?" asked Vivian shrewdly. "Or do they find it easier to think of us as incapable than to acknowledge that we're still full human beings with our own desires and dreams?" That night, after the dancing, yes, I danced. First with David, and then with several other gentlemen who asked. I stood on my little balcony, looking out at the Amsterdam lights reflecting in the water. Tomorrow we would begin sailing down the Rhine, and I would see parts of the world I'd only read about in books. I thought about my children, probably sitting around their campfire in Colorado, maybe wondering how I was doing alone in the house. I felt a pang of guilt about the deception, but also something else. A fierce joy that I was here, that I had chosen this, that I was proving to myself that Eleanor Mitchell was far from finished with living. My phone buzzed with a text message from Frank. "How's the first day, fellow adventurer?" I typed back, "Magical." "How's Amsterdam?" "Lonely without my favorite travel companion. But I found a great restaurant for tomorrow night. We'll have to come back here together someday." Together someday. The phrase made me smile. For the first time in years, someday felt like a promise instead of a postponement. I was just getting ready for bed when another text came in, this one from Jessica. "Hope you're having a quiet evening, Mom. Not staying up too late, I hope." I looked out at the glittering lights of Amsterdam, thought about the champagne and the dancing, and the plans for tomorrow's excursion to Cologne Cathedral, and typed back, "Just a quiet night at home, sweetheart. Sleep well." It wasn't entirely a lie. The ship was my home for the next 2 weeks, and compared to the adventures that lay ahead, tonight had been relatively quiet. As I drifted off to sleep in my narrow shipboard bed, I could feel the gentle motion of the river beneath us. Tomorrow we would wake up in a new place, and I would be a little bit more of the person I was meant to be. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. By the 4th day of the cruise, I had stopped being surprised by myself. I had climbed 528 steps to the top of Cologne Cathedral without getting winded. I had sampled snaps in a German distillery and declared it interesting, instead of choking like a proper grandmother should. Free, I had learned to play bridge with 3 strangers and discovered I was actually quite good at it. Most shocking of all, I had become the unofficial photographer for half the ship. After people discovered I had a good eye for capturing moments, my phone was filled with pictures of couples celebrating anniversaries, friends toasting new adventures, and solo travelers like myself proving that the best companion for seeing the world could be yourself. "Eleanor, there you are!" Vivian called from across the sun deck as we sailed through the Rhine Gorge. "Come settle an argument. Margaret insists that castle up there is where Rapunzel was imprisoned. But I say that's just tourist nonsense." I joined the group gathered at the rail, all of us craning our necks to see the medieval castle perched impossibly high on a cliff above the river. The Rhine Valley was everything the brochures had promised and more: fairy tale castles, terraced vineyards, and charming villages that looked like they'd been painted onto the landscape. Actually, I said, consulting the guidebook I'd been carrying everywhere, that's Rhinstein Castle, built in the 13th century. The Rapunzel legend is associated with several different castles in the region, but most scholars think the Brothers Grimm were inspired by a combination of local folklore rather than one specific location. The group stared at me. What? I asked. I used to be a librarian. Old habits, Eleanor Mitchell, said David, shaking his head in amazement. You are full of surprises. That had become the unofficial motto of my cruise experience. Every day brought new surprises, not just in the places we visited, but in discovering capabilities I'd forgotten I had. Yesterday in Strasbourg, I had successfully navigated the French, German city using nothing but a map and my rusty high school French. I had ordered lunch in a local bistro, helped an elderly French woman carry her groceries, and spent an hour in conversation with a group of university students who were impressed that an American grandmother was traveling solo. "Vuestas tras courageous," one of them had said. "You are very brave." Brave. When was the last time anyone had called me brave? The evenings on the ship had become my favorite part of each day. After dinner, when some passengers retired to their rooms, a core group of us would gather in the lounge for what David called the real conversations. We talked about everything: books we'd read, places we'd been, dreams we'd deferred, regrets we carried, hopes we still harbored. "I have a confession," said Susan one evening as we sat with our after-dinner coffee, watching the German countryside drift by in the twilight. "My daughter has called the ship 3 times to check on me. She's convinced I'm going to fall overboard or have a medical emergency or get lost in a foreign country." "What did you tell her?" asked Joan. "The truth. That I hiked 5 miles through the Black Forest yesterday and felt like I was 20 again." "And?" Susan laughed ruefully. She asked if I was taking my arthritis medication. This story was becoming a familiar refrain. Margaret's son had insisted she pack enough prescription medications for a month, even though the cruise was only 2 weeks. Hans's daughter had made him promise to call every single day. Vivian's family had tried to talk her out of the trip entirely, convinced that solo travel was too dangerous for a woman her age. "They're afraid," said John quietly. "Not of what might happen to us, but of what it means if we're still capable of having adventures. If we're not declining fast enough to need them, then what's their role in our lives?" It was a sobering thought, and one that had been growing in my mind as the days passed. My children's protectiveness wasn't really about my safety. It was about their need to feel necessary, to feel like they were good children taking care of their aging mother. My independence threatened that narrative. On the 7th day, we docked in Heidelberg, and I signed up for what the cruise director had warned was the most challenging excursion: a hike through the Philosopher's Path, followed by a tour of the famous castle ruins. It was a full day of walking, climbing, and exploring, and the guide made sure everyone understood the physical demands before we set off. "Mrs. Mitchell," the guide said as I signed the waiver, "this is quite strenuous. Are you sure you want to attempt it?" I looked around at the other passengers signing up, people of all ages, including several who were clearly younger but looked less fit than I felt. When had I internalized the idea that my age automatically disqualified me from physical challenges? "I'm sure," I said firmly. The hike was glorious. We walked through forests and along hillsides, stopping frequently to admire views of the Neckar River and the red rooftops of Heidelberg below. At the castle, I climbed every accessible tower and walked every rampart, taking pictures and asking questions, and feeling more alive than I had in years. But it was at lunch, sitting in a garden restaurant overlooking the city, that I had what I could only call an epiphany. I was sitting with David and a couple from Australia, sharing a bottle of local wine and comparing notes about our morning adventures, when David's phone rang. His face fell as he looked at the screen. "My daughter," he explained apologetically, stepping away to take the call. We could hear his side of the conversation. "Yes, I'm fine. No, I haven't fallen. Yes, I'm eating properly. No, I don't need you to call the ship." When he came back, he looked deflated. "Let me guess," said Janet, the Australian woman. "She's worried about you. She wants me to consider moving to a retirement community when I get back," David said quietly. "She says I'm getting too old to live alone." "How old are you?" I asked. 74. I looked at this man who had hiked for hours without complaint, who spoke 3 languages, who had been sharing fascinating stories about his travels throughout Asia. He was vibrant, intelligent, and clearly capable of taking care of himself. David, I said. What do you want to do when you get home? He looked surprised by the question. What do I want to do? Yes. Not what your daughter thinks you should do, not what's practical or safe or expected. What do I want to do? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the medieval city spread below us. I want to take that photography course I've been thinking about, he said finally. I want to learn to cook properly instead of just reheating frozen dinners. I want to… He paused, looking almost embarrassed. I want to take another cruise, maybe to the Mediterranean this time. Then do it, said Janet simply. But Sarah thinks. Sarah's not living your life, I interrupted. You are? That afternoon, as I stood in the ruins of Heidelberg Castle, looking out over a landscape that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries, I thought about David's daughter and my own children. They loved us, I didn't doubt that, but they had confused loving us with controlling us, protecting us with limiting us. I pulled out my phone and, on impulse, called Frank. Eleanor! How's the most adventurous woman on the Rhine? Frank, I said, I need to ask you something. When we get home, are you going to go back to being the Frank who lets Maria worry about him opening pickle jars? There was a long pause. Are you going back to being the Eleanor who stays home and waters plants? No, I said. And as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. I'm not. Then neither am I. That evening at dinner, I made an announcement to our table of 8. When I get home, I said, I'm going to tell my children about this trip. All of it, asked Vivian. All of it, the hiking, the dancing, the wine tasting, the fact that I've had the time of my life without their permission or supervision. What if they're angry? Asked Susan. I thought about that question as I looked around the table at these people who had become my friends, who had seen me laugh and learn and grow over the past week. What if my children were angry? What if they were hurt or disappointed or felt betrayed? Then they'll have to decide whether they want a relationship with who I actually am, I said, or if they prefer the diminished version of me they've been trying to create. The conversation that followed lasted late into the evening, as we talked about boundaries and expectations, about aging and independence, about the difference between being loved and being managed. By the time we said goodnight, I felt like I was part of something bigger than just a river cruise. I was part of a quiet revolution of people refusing to be sidelined by their own family's fears. As I stood on my balcony that night, watching the lights of small German towns pass by in the darkness, I realized that this journey had become about much more than proving I could travel alone. It had become about reclaiming the person I had been before grief, and my children's well-meaning restrictions had convinced me I was fragile. Tomorrow we would dock in Switzerland, and I would see the Alps for the first time. In a week, I would be reunited with Frank in Budapest, and we would explore that magical city together before flying home. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Mitchell, standing alone on a ship in the middle of Europe, more myself than I had been in years. Budapest was a city of surprises, and Frank Torres was full of them. When I disembarked from the Viking cruise ship, after 14 days of the most transformative experience of my life, I found him waiting on the dock with a bouquet of Hungarian flowers and a smile that made him look 10 years younger. Welcome to Budapest, world traveler, he said, kissing my cheek in a way that made my heart flutter like a teenager's. How does it feel to be a seasoned European adventurer? It feels, I said, looking around at the magnificent city rising from both banks of the Danube, like I'm just getting started. We spent 3 magical days exploring Budapest together. Frank had become quite the expert navigator during his solo travels, leading me through the thermal baths, up to the fisherman's bastion for sunrise, and through the great market hall where we sampled Hungarian pastries and laughed like old friends discovering each other for the first time. But it was on our last evening, sitting in a cafe overlooking the Danube as the sun set behind the Parliament building, that Frank asked the question I'd been dreading. Eleanor, what are you going to tell them when we get home? I'd been thinking about this for days, ever since my conversation with David at Heidelberg Castle. The cruise had ended 2 days ago, and in that time I'd received 7 text messages from my children, all variations on the same theme. Hope you're not overdoing it. Mom, remember to rest. We'll be home soon to check on you. They had no idea that I was sitting in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, planning my next adventure with a man who made me laugh and think and feel alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I'm going to tell them the truth, I said finally. Frank reached across the table and took my hand. Over the past 3 weeks, this gesture had become natural, comfortable, All of it, all of it. The cruise, Amsterdam, Budapest. I squeezed his fingers. I'm 72 years old, Frank. I don't have time to live my life according to other people's fears anymore. Even if it makes them angry. I thought about my dinner companions on the ship, Vivian and David and Susan, and all the others who had shared their stories of adult children, who preferred diminished parents to independent ones. Especially if it makes them angry, I said. Their anger will tell me everything I need to know about whether they love me or just the idea of taking care of me. The flight home was long but comfortable. Frank and I had upgraded to business class. Another decision that would have horrified my budget, conscious children, and we spent the hours looking through the hundreds of photos on our phones, reliving the adventures of the past 3 weeks. Look at this one, Frank said, showing me a picture of myself standing at the bow of the cruise ship, my hair whipping in the wind, my face radiant with joy. When was the last time you looked this happy? I studied the photo, barely recognizing the vibrant woman smiling back at me. When had I last looked this happy? Maybe not since before Robert got sick. Maybe not in 10 years. I want to frame this one, I said, taking a screenshot. I want to put it on my mantle so I never forget who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone else thinks I should be. We landed in Cleveland on a Tuesday morning. 3 days before my children were due back from their Colorado trip, Frank insisted on driving me home from the airport, despite my protests that I could take a taxi. Alina Mitchell, he said as he loaded my suitcase into his car, after 3 weeks of adventures together, I'm not about to abandon you for the ride home. My house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it, but I felt like an alien visiting someone else's life. The furniture seemed smaller, the rooms more confining. Even the family photos on the mantel looked different, less like a celebration of my life, and more like evidence of a person who had defined herself entirely through other people's needs. It's going to take some adjustment, Frank said gently, as if reading my thoughts. I feel like Cinderella after midnight, I admitted. Like I'm supposed to transform back into the old Eleanor who's grateful to be left behind. Are you going to? I looked around at the house where I'd raised my children, where I'd cared for Robert through his final illness, where I'd spent 5 years gradually shrinking my world to match everyone else's expectations. Then I thought about the woman in Frank's photograph, radiant and alive and unapologetically happy. No, I said firmly, I'm not. My children returned from Colorado on Friday evening, all 3 of them arriving within an hour of each other to check on me. I had spent the week preparing for this moment, not just emotionally, but practically. I'd printed photo albums from the cruise, had my best pictures framed, and even created a small slideshow on my laptop. When they walked through my door, carrying camping gear and Colorado souvenirs, I was sitting in the living room wearing one of my new European outfits, my hair styled in a way I'd learned from Vivian, looking more put together than I had in months. Mom, you look... Sarah paused, clearly trying to find the right word. Different. Rested, supplied Michael. The quiet time was good for you. Jessica was studying me more carefully, her intuitive nature picking up on changes her siblings missed. Mom, did you do something different with your hair? I smiled. Sit down, all of you. I have something to tell you. They arranged themselves around the living room like they were children again, except now they were the worried parents, and I was the one who had to account for my behavior. The irony wasn't lost on me. First, I said, I want you to know that I love you all very much. Everything I'm about to tell you comes from love. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that said, what has Mom done now? While you were in Colorado, I continued, I took a trip of my own. What kind of trip? Sarah asked suspiciously. You didn't drive anywhere alone, did you? You know how I feel about... I flew to Amsterdam, I said calmly. I took a 2-week river cruise down the Rhine. I visited Germany, France, and Switzerland. Then I spent 3 days in Budapest with Frank Torres from next door. The silence was deafening. Michael spoke first. Mom, that's not funny. I'm not trying to be funny. I picked up the photo album from the coffee table and handed it to him. I'm trying to be honest. The next 20 minutes were a whirlwind of disbelief, accusations, and hurt feelings. How could I have lied to them? How could I have been so irresponsible? What if something had happened? What if I'd gotten sick or lost or hurt? But nothing happened, I said patiently. Nothing bad anyway. Look at the pictures, reluctantly. They began flipping through the album. Photos of me hiking in the Black Forest, dancing at the captain's dinner, climbing castle ruins, standing confidently in front of European landmarks, looking happier and more alive than any of them had seen me in years. "Mom," Jessica said quietly, holding up a picture of me and Frank at a Budapest cafe, are you and Mr. Torres? We're exploring the possibility of a relationship," I said. "Frank is a wonderful man, and spending time with him has reminded me that my life isn't over just because your father died." Sarah's face was flushed with anger. "This is unbelievable. You lied to us, you put yourself in danger. You could have been taken advantage of or mugged or I could have lived," I interrupted. "Which is exactly what happened." "Mom, you're 72 years old," Michael said, his voice tight with frustration. "You can't just go gallivanting around Europe like you're 20. "Why not?" I asked simply. The question seemed to stump him. Because you could get hurt. Because it's not safe. Because we worry about you. And because you were embarrassed that I wanted to go camping with you." The room fell silent again. "That's what this is really about, isn't it?" I continued. "You were embarrassed by your old mother wanting to tag along on your family vacation. You didn't want to deal with me, so you convinced yourselves that leaving me behind was for my own good." "That's not," Sarah started. "Yes, it is." I stood up, walking to the mantel where I'd placed the framed photo of myself on the ship's bow. "For 5 years since your father died, I've been shrinking, getting smaller and smaller, less and less of myself, until I fit into this tiny box you've created for me, the box labeled aging mother who needs to be managed." I turned back to face them. "But this trip reminded me that I'm not just your mother. I'm Eleanor Mitchell. I'm a person with my own dreams and desires and capabilities. And I refuse to spend whatever years I have left apologizing for still being alive." Jessica's eyes were filling with tears. "Mom, we never meant." "I know you didn't mean to," I said gently. "But that doesn't change what happened. You've been so focused on protecting me that you forgot I might still want to live." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Michael, always the practical one, asked, "So what happens now?" I smiled, thinking of all the conversations I'd had with my fellow travelers about this exact question. "Now I live my life," I said. "I'm signing up for that photography class at the community college. Frank and I are planning a trip to Ireland in the spring. I'm joining the hiking club at the senior center, and I'm volunteering at the literacy center downtown." "And if we don't like it?" Sarah asked, her lawyer's voice back in place. I looked at my eldest daughter. This accomplished woman who had somehow convinced herself that loving me meant limiting me. "Then you'll have to decide whether you want a relationship with who I actually am," I said, "or if you prefer the diminished version of me you've been trying to create." They left that night still upset, still processing, still struggling to reconcile the vibrant woman in the photographs with the fragile mother they'd convinced themselves they were protecting. I didn't expect them to understand immediately. Change is hard for everyone, especially when it challenges fundamental assumptions about family roles and aging. But as I stood at my front window, watching their cars disappear down the street, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of authenticity. For the first time since Robert died, I was fully myself again. Frank appeared on his front porch as if he'd been waiting for my children to leave. "How did it go?" he called across our yards. "About as well as expected," I called back. "Want to come over for coffee? I'll tell you all about it." As Frank walked across the grass between our houses, I thought about the woman who had booked that cruise in a moment of hurt and defiance. She'd had no idea that she wasn't just planning a vacation, she was planning a revolution. A quiet revolution against the expectations and limitations that had been slowly suffocating her. That woman had been brave without knowing it. She'd been desperate to prove she was still alive, still capable, still worthy of adventure and love. 3 weeks later, I was no longer that desperate woman. I was someone who knew her worth, who had reclaimed her independence, who had remembered that 72 was not too old for anything. I was Eleanor Mitchell, and I was just getting started. 6 months later, Jessica called me while I was packing for the Ireland trip. "Mom," she said, "I owe you an apology." "Oh, I was talking to a friend today whose mother is about your age. She was complaining about how her mother won't leave the house anymore, won't try new things, won't even go out to dinner." And I realized that I was complaining 6 months ago that my mother was too adventurous. I smiled, folding my new walking boots into my suitcase. And I think I'd rather have a mother who's too adventurous than one who's given up on living. After we hung up, I stood at my bedroom window looking out at Frank's house, where he was probably packing his own suitcase for our Irish adventure. Tomorrow we would fly to Dublin, and I would see the cliffs of Moher and kiss the Blarney Stone and drink Guinness in pubs where Irish musicians played traditional songs. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be Eleanor Mitchell, not the woman my children thought I should be, not the widow who had forgotten how to dream, but the woman who had looked at a river cruise brochure and decided she was worth the adventure. At 72, I had finally learned the most important lesson of all: it's never too late to come home to yourself.